The cold was a constant companion. It seeped through the worn leather of her boots, a damp and persistent chill that lived in her bones. Alara had forgotten what it was to be truly warm. She knelt on the unforgiving stone floor of the Blackwood Pack's great hall, her knees aching and her hands raw. The water in the bucket beside her had a thin film of ice clinging to its surface. Each time she plunged the rag into it, the cold bit at her cracked knuckles like a nest of angry ants. Pain was just another sensation, as common as hunger or the ache of loneliness in her chest. They called her the Dreg, the Omega orphan left on their doorstep 18 winters ago, a nameless burden with no status and no worth. She was a ghost who scrubbed their floors and washed their clothes, visible only when they needed someone to blame or someone to hurt. Her hair, the color of winter wheat, was tied back with a piece of twine. It was lank and dull, just like the rest of her. She kept her eyes downcast, a habit learned through harsh lessons. To meet the gaze of a ranked pack member was to invite scorn, or worse, a casual blow. She could feel their eyes on her now. The hall was filling up, the air growing thick with the scent of roasting meat, pine from the great fire, and the musk of wolfkin. They were celebrating the midwinter hunt, a feast she would only experience through the scraps left on the plates she would later have to clean. A low chuckle cut through the noise. Look at it, scurrying like a rat. Alara's shoulders tensed. She did not need to look up to know it was Lyra. Lyra, the pack alpha's daughter, whose beauty was as sharp and cruel as a shard of ice. Her voice was always laced with a venom reserved especially for Alara. Beside Lyra stood Kale, a broad-shouldered beta whose advances Alara had silently rebuffed months ago. His pride had been wounded, and his resentment had festered into a particularly nasty form of torment. He saw her not as a person, but as an insult to his status. "Still singing your pathetic little songs, Dreg?" Lyra's silver-tipped boot nudged the bucket. "No one wants to hear your whining." Alara flinched. She had been humming, a nervous habit she could not seem to break. It was an old song, a melody with no words she could remember, something that felt like a phantom limb of a memory she never had. It was the only thing that was truly hers. She stopped humming, her throat closing up. She squeezed the rag, the icy water a welcome shock that grounded her. "I asked you a question," Lyra snapped. Alara swallowed, her voice a dry whisper. "No, I wasn't." "Liar," Kale sneered. He took a step forward, his shadow falling over her. "It's worthless, just like you. No one remembers those old songs. No one cares." He punctuated his statement by kicking the bucket. Icy, filthy water sloshed over Alara, soaking the front of her thin tunic. It was a gasp-inducing cold, a physical shock that stole her breath. A wave of laughter rippled through the nearby pack members. Humiliation burned hot in her cheeks, a stark contrast to the freezing water clinging to her skin. She squeezed her eyes shut, her world shrinking to the sting of the cold and the roar of their laughter. Worthless, invisible, a rat. The words were stones they threw at her every day, and she was covered in the bruises. But as she knelt there, shivering and disgraced, a tiny, stubborn ember of defiance refused to be extinguished. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. She gritted her teeth, the muscles in her jaw aching, and forced herself to take a breath. She would endure. It was all she knew how to do. She would clean up this mess, and the next one, and the one after that. She would survive their cruelty until the sun rose again. It was a bleak existence, but it was hers. As she reached for the fallen bucket, a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the great hall's heavy oak doors. The fire in the massive hearth faltered, sputtering and sending a cloud of ash into the room. A collective murmur of unease swept through the pack. The wind howled outside, its voice rising to a predatory shriek. It was not a normal storm. This wind had teeth. What was that? Someone muttered near the fire. The pack alpha, a grim-faced man named Borin, rose from his high seat. The storm has turned. Bar the shutters. But as betas moved to obey, Lyra saw another opportunity for cruelty. She pointed a slender finger toward the now rattling doors. We're low on firewood for the upper chambers. The dreg can fetch some more. Her smile was a razor's edge. She could use the fresh air. She's starting to smell. Kale laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Good idea. Let the storm wash the filth off her. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's fragile composure. It flew inward, slamming against the stone wall with a deafening crack. A wall of white fury roared into the hall. Snow and ice blasted into the room, extinguishing torches and sending people stumbling back. The blizzard was not just a storm. It was a living, breathing entity of pure rage. "Get the wood!" Kale roared at her over the gale, shoving her roughly from behind. Alara stumbled over the threshold, out of the relative warmth of the hall and into the maelstrom. The world vanished. There was no up, no down, only a blinding, screaming vortex of white. The cold was a physical blow, a solid thing that hammered the air from her lungs. It was colder than the bucket water, colder than the stone floor. It was the cold of the void. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound swallowed by the storm's howl. She was alone. She tried to orient herself, to find the woodpile that should have been just a few yards away. But she could see nothing. The snow was a thick, moving curtain, and the wind sliced at her exposed skin like 1,000 tiny claws. She took a step, then another, her hands outstretched, searching for a familiar wall, a post, anything. There was nothing. She was lost within seconds. Panic gave way to a primal terror. She was going to die out here. They had sent her out here to die. A sob, frozen before it could fully form, caught in her throat. She tried to turn back, to find the door to the great hall, but she was completely disoriented. Every direction was the same howling abyss. Her wet clothes were freezing solid, turning into a suit of ice. Her limbs grew heavy, numb. The shivering became violent, then subsided into a deep, dangerous lethargy. Her mind grew foggy. The world was just noise and pain and a crushing, overwhelming cold. How long had she been stumbling? Minutes? An hour? Time had lost all meaning. She fell, her knees hitting something hard beneath the snow. She did not have the strength to get back up. This is it, she thought, a strange sense of calm descending. This is the end. The cold was no longer painful. It was becoming a strange, soothing blanket. She curled into a ball, pulling her knees to her chest, her body's last, futile attempt to preserve its fading warmth. Her eyelids felt heavy as stones. As her consciousness began to fray, a scent cut through the blizzard's sterile fury. It was coppery and raw. Blood. And with it came a sound. Not the wind, but a low, pained groan. It was close. Her eyes fluttered open. Through the swirling snow she saw a shape, a dark mass against the suffocating white. It was huge, far bigger than any wolf from the Blackwood pack. A monstrous creature of shadow and fur, its form half buried in a snowdrift. It was a wolf, but a wolf of mythic proportions. Its fur was the color of charcoal and midnight, and even in the dim, storm-choked light, she could see the dark stain of blood matting the fur along its flank. A deep, ragged gash wept crimson onto the pure white snow. Fear should have consumed her. She should have stayed where she was, waiting for the end. But she did not. An inexplicable pull, a strange and powerful current, drew her toward the wounded animal. It was a feeling that defied logic, a hum beneath her skin that resonated with the dying creature. She began to crawl. Her frozen limbs protested, every movement an agony. She dragged herself through the snow, the distance of a few feet feeling like a mile. The wolf's breathing was shallow, a rattling sound in its massive chest. Its great head was lowered, its eyes closed. It was dying. Just like her. Maybe we can die together, she thought, the idea a strange comfort. At least she would not be alone. She reached it, her numb fingers brushing against its coarse, cold fur. She expected the wolf to stir, to snarl, to lash out with its last breath. It did nothing. It was barely conscious. Looking closer at the wound, she saw it was deep and vicious. It was not a wound from any animal she knew. It looked almost ceremonial, jagged and cruel. Without thinking, driven by an instinct she did not know she possessed, she pressed her palm flat against the wound. She had no idea what she was doing. Trying to stop the bleeding? Trying to offer some small, pathetic comfort? The moment her skin, her bare palm, made direct contact with the wolf's bloodied fur, the world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A cataclysm of heat and light erupted from the point of contact. A searing, blinding fire shot up her arm, straight into her heart, a pain so intense it was ecstasy. It was a brand, a claim, a searing of her very soul. She screamed, a sound that was stolen by the wind, but she felt it tear from her lungs. A silver light, brilliant as a new star, flared from her hand, engulfing her and the wolf in its incandescent glow. The blizzard itself seemed to recoil from the pure, impossible energy. Beneath her palm, the flesh stitched itself together. The bleeding stopped. The ragged edges of the wound sealed as if they had never been. And then, the heat focused, coalescing on the back of her wrist. The pain became a sharp, precise burn, like a smith's mark being hammered into her skin. She cried out, pulling her hand back. There, on her pale, frost-bitten skin, was a mark. It glowed with a soft, silvery light, an intricate and impossible tattoo that had not been there a second before. It was the image of a snarling wolf's head, its fur rendered in impossible detail, encircled by a crown of blooming winter roses. It was beautiful and terrifying. What was happening? Before she could process the glowing brand on her wrist, the wolf began to change. Bones cracked and reformed, fur receded, the massive, bestial form folded in on itself, shrinking and shifting with a sickening speed that defied nature. Where the giant wolf had lain, a man now knelt, his head bowed. He was enormous even on his knees. Broad-shouldered and powerfully built, his bare skin gleaming in the strange, magical light that still lingered in the air. His dark hair was matted with snow and blood. He slowly, unsteadily, lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. They were not human eyes. They were the color of molten gold, glowing with an inner fire. They were ancient, filled with a loneliness so profound it stole her breath, and a power that made the raging blizzard seem like a summer breeze. They were the eyes of a predator, a king. He looked at her, his golden gaze sweeping over her face, her frozen clothes, her trembling form. There was no confusion in his eyes. There was only recognition, a deep, soul-shaking recognition, as if he had been searching for her for 1,000 years and had finally, impossibly, found her in the heart of a blizzard. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, deep as thunder and soft as falling snow. It vibrated through her, a sound her very soul recognized even if her mind did not. "You're her." The words were not a question. They were a statement of absolute, irrefutable fact. He reached out, his hand, large enough to encircle her entire head, gently taking her arm. His touch was not cold, but blazingly hot. Where his fingers wrapped around her wrist, it did not burn, but it sent a shock wave of warmth through her entire frozen body. He turned her arm over, his golden eyes fixing on the glowing mark. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of possessive, triumphant satisfaction. "Mine." Alara's mind was a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. This was impossible. This was madness. She tried to pull her arm back, but his grip was like iron, unyielding, but not painful. She was a mouse in the gentle grasp of a lion. What are you?" she whispered, her voice cracking. He did not answer her question directly. His gaze lifted from the mark back to her face. A flicker of something, tenderness, pain, awe, crossed his harsh, predatorily beautiful features. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she trembled. "I have you," he said, his voice softer now. "You are safe." Safe? She had been sent out to die, had nearly frozen to death, and had just witnessed an impossible transformation. A magical brand had burned itself onto her skin. A man with glowing gold eyes was holding her in the middle of a supernatural storm, calling her his. Nothing about this was safe. And yet, the agonizing cold that had been seconds from claiming her was gone, replaced by the radiating heat from his body. The howling of the wind seemed more distant, and the deep, resonant hum beneath her skin that had started when she first saw him was now a steady, calming vibration, a song of belonging that answered the lonely ache in her soul. Her body, her instincts, her very spirit were drawn to him with a gravitational pull she could not fight. Her mind, however, was screaming. This man was power incarnate. He was danger. He was everything she had been taught to fear and avoid. She was worthless, a dreg, a nothing, and he was a king. She could feel it in his presence, in the absolute authority that radiated from him like heat from a forge. This was a catastrophic mistake. He had the wrong person. "No," she whimpered, shaking her head. "There's a mistake. I'm nobody." His expression hardened, but not at her. It hardened at her words. A flicker of rage, cold and deadly, flashed in his golden eyes. "They were wrong," he stated, his voice dropping to a growl. "They will pay for what they did to you." Before she could ask what he meant, a new sound cut through the storm. A howl. But this was not the wind. It was a wolf. And it was answered by another and another. A chorus of howls, disciplined and close. The man, the king, turned his head, his gaze piercing the whiteout. "My guard," he said, his voice tight. He was still weak. The magical healing had taken a toll on her and on him. He swayed slightly, and his grip on her arm tightened as if to steady himself. In the swirling snow, shadows began to resolve into shapes. More giant wolves, smaller than he had been but still enormous, were converging on their position. They moved with silent, deadly purpose. Suddenly, a figure appeared from the edge of the woods, moving with a slinking, furtive gait. It was Kale. He had not gone back into the hall. He had followed her. He had been watching. His eyes were wide, not with the awe Alara felt, but with a greedy, terrified shock. He stared at the man kneeling in the snow, at the mark glowing on Alara's wrist, at the way the king held her. His face, already pale from the cold, turned ashen. He had been sent to confirm a kill. Instead, he had found a miracle. A disastrous, world-altering miracle. Kale saw the supreme leader of all packs, the Alpha King Lycan, who was supposed to be bleeding out in the snow, alive. And he saw him with the dreg, the worthless Omega. He saw the soul bond mark glowing on her skin. He understood, in one sickening flash of insight, what she was. She was the king's fated mate, the one foretold in prophecies, the one he had been searching for centuries, the key to his power, his future, his kingdom. And Kale's master, the one who had orchestrated the ambush, wanted the king dead and that power for himself. This changed everything. She was no longer worthless. She was the most valuable prize in the world. Fear gave way to a calculating ambition in Kale's eyes. He met Alara's terrified gaze for a split second, a look of twisted triumph on his face, before he melted back into the blizzard's cover. He had to report this. The Shadow King had to know. Alara saw him go, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She did not understand what she had just seen in his eyes, but she knew it was a new and terrible threat. The king's guard arrived, shifting from wolf to human form in a seamless, practiced motion. They were a dozen warriors, scarred and hard-eyed, and they immediately formed a protective circle, their gazes scanning the storm for threats. Their shock at seeing their king alive and with a strange woman was quickly suppressed by iron discipline. An older warrior with a scarred face and silver hair stepped forward, bowing his head. "My king, we thought you were lost." His relief was palpable. "I was, Gunner," Lycan said, his voice strained. He used Alara's arm to help pull himself to his feet. He was unsteady, but he stood, a towering, formidable presence even while wounded and bare-chested in the raging storm. He did not let her go. The ambush was well planned. They used shadow blades. Gunnar's eyes narrowed. The Ember Covenant. It was a curse. Lycan nodded, his golden eyes finding Alara's again. He pulled her closer to his side, shielding her from the wind with his own body. The heat coming off him was a furnace. She found me. She healed me. Gunnar and the other guards looked at Alara, truly looked at her for the first time. Their hard eyes widened as they saw the still faintly glowing mark on her wrist. A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed around the circle. They understood. It is her? Gunnar whispered, his voice filled with a reverence that made Alara shrink away. She is my mate, Lycan declared, his voice ringing with absolute power, a king claiming his queen. He wrapped his arm fully around her shoulders, pulling her flesh against his side. Her name is Alara. She is under my protection. Anyone who harms her will answer to me. The guards immediately dropped to one knee in the snow, their heads bowed. Our queen, they chorused, their voices thick with emotion. Alara's head was spinning. Queen? Mate? Her? The girl who scrubbed floors and ate scraps? It was a dream. A fever dream brought on by the cold. It had to be. Lycan swayed again, a wave of dizziness washing over him. The healing had taken its toll. We need to get back, Gunnar said, rising. The Blackwood pack hall is closest. Lycan's expression darkened. It was on their land I was ambushed. They are either incompetent or complicit. His gaze was hard as granite. But we have no choice. We need shelter. He looked down at Alara, his golden eyes softening. You are freezing. He shrugged off the heavy fur cloak one of his guards offered and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was impossibly warm and heavy, smelling of pine, wood smoke, and him. It swallowed her small frame, a cocoon of impossible safety. As they moved, a phalanx of warriors surrounding the king and his precious cargo, Alara was swept along in a tide of events she could not comprehend. They reached the great hall, the doors thrown open by Lycan's guard. Their entrance was a thunderclap. The feasting and laughter inside died instantly. 100 faces turned, their expressions of merriment turning to shock, then fear. They saw the giant, half-naked king, his body littered with minor cuts, his eyes blazing gold. They saw his elite royal guard, weapons drawn, and they saw him holding Alara, the Dreg, wrapped in his royal cloak. Alpha Boren's face went pale. Lyra's jaw dropped, her cruel beauty curdling into disbelief. Kale, who had slipped back inside, stood frozen in the crowd, his face a mask of feigned ignorance and terror. Lycan's gaze swept the room, and the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. His eyes locked onto Alpha Boren. There was an attempt on my life. On your lands, Boren. Under your watch. Boren stumbled forward, bowing low. My king, I had no idea. We knew nothing of this. Your ignorance is no excuse, Lycan snarled, his voice a low promise of violence. I will have answers. His gaze then fell on Lyra, and he saw the flicker of recognition and hatred in her eyes as she looked at Alara. He saw it all in an instant, the petty cruelties, the abuse. A low growl vibrated in his chest. But before he could speak, before he could mete out the justice he so clearly intended, the world descended into chaos once more. The great windows of the hall did not just break, they exploded inward. Shards of glass and splintered wood flew through the air. Black-clad figures swarmed into the room, moving with silent, unnatural speed. They wore masks of polished obsidian, and their blades glowed with a faint, sickly red light. The Ember Covenant. Lycan's guard reacted instantly, forming a wall of steel around him and Alara. The sounds of battle erupted. The clash of swords, grunts of pain, the snarls of wolves as some of the guards shifted to their more lethal forms. But the attackers were prepared. They were not trying to kill the king now. They were trying to get to her. Several of them threw something. Small, dark orbs that burst on the floor, releasing clouds of thick, black smoke that smelled of ash and brimstone. It was a smokescreen, sowing confusion and panic. "Alara, stay with me!" Lycan commanded, his arm a band of steel around her. But in the chaos, a figure burst through the smoke. He was not like the others. He was tall and cloaked in shadows that seemed to cling to him, his face hidden by a deeper darkness. It was Morven, the Shadow King. He moved with a speed that was a blur. He was not aiming for Lycan. He was aiming for her. Lycan shoved her behind him, meeting Morven's charge with a roar. Their collision was like two mountains crashing together. But the ambush and the magical healing had left Lycan weakened. Morven was at full strength. As they fought, two of the Covenant assassins broke through the line. They were on Alara in a heartbeat. Before she could scream, a heavy chain was thrown over her. It was not iron. It was silver. The moment the metal touched her, it was agony. Not the searing heat of the bond, but a deadening, soul-leeching cold. It felt like her very life force was being siphoned away. The glowing mark on her wrist flickered and died. The connection to Lycan instantly choked. The loss was a physical blow, a tearing, ripping sensation in her chest, as if part of her soul had just been violently amputated. She cried out, a sound of pure agony. "Alara!" Lycan's roar was one of fury and pain. He felt the bond sever, a white-hot knife in his own heart. He turned, his golden eyes wild, but Morven pressed his attack, forcing him back. The assassins dragged the struggling Alara away. Her legs would not hold her. The silver was poison, weakening her, making the world swim in a gray haze. She saw Lycan, fighting like a cornered god, trying to get to her. His eyes met hers across the chaotic room, and the despair and rage in them were a mirror of her own. Then they were dragging her through one of the shattered windows, out into the raging blizzard once more. The last thing she saw of the great hall was Lycan throwing Morven aside and starting after her, only to be swarmed by a dozen more assassins. The cold of the storm was nothing compared to the cold of the silver chains. It was a cold that reached into her soul. They dragged her through the snow, her body limp and unresponsive. The hope that had sparked to life only an hour before was brutally extinguished. She had been found only to be lost. She had been given a name, Queen, only to be stolen like an object. The despair was a suffocating weight, heavier than the snow, colder than the ice. She was worthless after all, a pawn in a game of kings, and she had just been captured by the enemy. Consciousness became a tattered thing, a series of disjointed, painful moments. The biting wind, the rough hands hauling her onto a horse, the endless, jarring ride through the storm-choked darkness. The silver chains were a constant torment, a leech draining her of warmth, strength, and hope. The connection to Lycan was a gaping wound in her spirit, a silent scream in a space that had so recently been filled with a song of belonging. She was taken to a fortress of black, jagged stone that seemed to drink the light from the sky. It was a place of sharp angles and cold echoes, built into the side of a frozen mountain. This was Morven's stronghold, the heart of the Ember Covenant's power. They threw her into a cell. It was not stone, but carved from the mountain's living ice. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, But the silver chains were gone, replaced by manacles of cold iron bolted to the wall. The absence of the silver was a small mercy, but the wound in her soul remained, a hollow ache that made her want to curl up and die. She was alone in the frozen dark, the brief, impossible dream of warmth and belonging shattered. He had called her his queen. He had looked at her as if she were the sunrise, and now he was gone. She was back to being nothing, only now her cage was made of ice instead of scorn. The self-doubt she had lived with her entire life came rushing back, a familiar, toxic flood. He had been mistaken. She wasn't a queen. She was just a lure, a weakness he never knew he had until it was too late. Her worthlessness had not just condemned her, it had gotten him hurt, perhaps even killed. Time passed in a blur of shivering and despair. How long had she been here? A day? 2? A guard would occasionally shove a piece of stale bread and a cup of water through a slot in the door, but she had no appetite. The hunger in her soul was far greater than the hunger in her stomach. Then, the door to her cell creaked open. Light spilled in, momentarily blinding her. A tall figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, the shadows clinging to him like a cloak. It was Morven. He stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp way, with eyes the color of chips of flint and hair as black as a raven's wing. He looked at her, chained to the wall, and a slow, superior smile spread across his face. "The lost little dove," he said, his voice smooth and cold as the ice around them. "Lycan's secret treasure. To think he found you scrubbing floors. The irony is delicious." Alara stared back at him, her fear a cold knot in her belly. She refused to speak, to give him the satisfaction. He walked around her, circling her like a wolf inspecting its prey. "You have no idea what you are, do you? You think this is about a fated mate, a children's fairy tale." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "The bond is real, yes, but it is not about love. It is about power." He stopped in front of her, his flint-gray eyes boring into hers. "Lycan's line is ancient. They are tied to the heart of this land, to its oldest magic. But that connection has been dormant for 1,000 years. It requires a catalyst, a key, to unlock its full potential. That key is you." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. Key? Power? What was he talking about? "The first winter," Morven continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That is the name of the magic sleeping in your blood. A power of absolute zero, of creation and destruction. The power to freeze the world or to give it new life. With it, Lycan would be a god, but with it," he leaned closer, his breath a cold fog in the air, "I will be an emperor." He explained his plan with chilling clarity. He would not kill her. He would perform a ritual, a perversion of the bonding ceremony. He would use his shadow magic and her despair to sever her soul from Lycan's and forcibly bind it to his own. He would steal the bond, and with it, the power of the first winter. Lycan will be left a hollow shell, his power broken, his soul crippled. I will take his throne, his kingdom, and his destiny. And you," he said, tracing a cold finger along her jaw, "will be the instrument of my ascension." Alara flinched away from his touch, a wave of revulsion and terror washing over her. He wanted to use her to destroy Lycan, to destroy the only person who had ever looked at her with kindness, with value. "He will come for me," she whispered, the words tasting of desperate hope and defiance. Morven's smile widened. I'm counting on it. His rage will make him reckless. He will walk right into my trap. By the time he reaches this chamber, the ritual will be complete. He will arrive just in time to watch you become mine. He turned and left, plunging her back into darkness. But his words lingered, seeds of a new and terrible despair. He was right. Lycan would come for her. He would risk everything, and she would be the reason for his downfall. The weight of it was crushing, a despair so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. She sagged against her chains, tears finally freezing on her cheeks. She was worse than worthless. She was a weapon, pointed at the heart of the only good thing that had ever happened to her. Hold on. The voice was not in the cell. It was in her head. It was a whisper across a vast and broken distance, faint but unmistakable. It was his voice. Alara's head snapped up. She looked around the empty, icy cell, her heart pounding. Lycan? She whispered into the darkness. I feel you. The voice came again, a little stronger this time, a thread of warmth in the unending cold. It was him. He was using the broken bond, pushing his will, his strength across the agonizing void between them. The bond is not broken. It is only stretched. He cannot sever what the fates have woven. Hold on, Alara. Tears of relief streamed down her face. He was alive. He was fighting. He was coming. I'm coming for you, he promised, his voice filling her head, a shield against Morven's chilling words. Do not let him break you. You are stronger than you know. You are my queen. The connection faded, the effort too great to sustain. But it was enough. The tiny ember of defiance that had flickered in the great hall, the ember she thought had been extinguished forever, glowed anew. It was no longer just stubbornness. It was hope. A fierce, desperate hope. Morven thought she was a key, a tool, a dove. He was wrong. She was the mate of the Alpha King, and she would not be the instrument of his destruction. She would hold on. The next time the door opened, it was not Morven. It was his masked guards. They unshackled her from the wall, their grips rough and impersonal, and dragged her from the cell. Her legs were weak, but she forced them to hold her. She would not be dragged to her fate like a slaughtered lamb. She would walk. They took her to a vast circular chamber at the heart of the fortress. The walls were black ice, and the floor was carved with a complex array of glowing red runes. In the center of the room was a stone altar. The air crackled with a malevolent energy that made her skin crawl. Morven was waiting for her, dressed in ceremonial robes of black and silver. His Ember Covenant cultists stood in a circle around the chamber, their obsidian masks hiding their faces, their voices a low, guttural chant. The hour of my ascension is at hand, Morven announced, his voice booming in the enclosed space. Bring her. The guards forced her onto the cold stone altar, chaining her wrists and ankles with the same soul-leeching silver chains from before. The agonizing cold returned, 10 times worse in this place of concentrated dark magic. The wound in her soul screamed, and the faint connection to Lycan was choked off once more. Morven stood over her, a ceremonial dagger in his hand. The blade was not steel, but carved from a shard of pure shadow. Do not fight it, little dove, he purred. This will be so much easier if you simply give in to your despair. He began the ritual, his chanting rising in volume, the red runes on the floor flaring with light. The power in the room converged on her, a crushing weight of malice and greed. It felt like being torn apart, molecule by molecule. The pain was beyond anything she had ever imagined, but through the agony, she clung to Lycan's words. "Hold on. You are stronger than you know." Suddenly, a tremor shook the entire fortress. A deep, resonant howl echoed from outside, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a sound that shook the very foundations of the mountain. It was Lycan. Morven smiled. Right on schedule. A series of earth-shattering booms followed as Lycan's forces laid siege to the fortress gates. The sounds of battle, distant at first, grew closer and closer. Screams and the clash of steel echoed down the frozen hallways. "He is here," Morven said, his eyes glittering with triumph. He raised the shadow dagger over Alara's heart. And now, he will see his hope die. The pain of the ritual intensified, a vortex of darkness trying to swallow her whole. Despair was a tempting abyss, promising an end to the agony. She could just let go, let it all end. But then she thought of Lycan's golden eyes. She thought of his voice in her mind. She thought of the word, queen. No, she would not break. Just as Morven began to plunge the dagger down, the massive stone doors to the chamber exploded inward. Not with a boom, but with a silent, concussive force of raw power. Lycan stood there, framed by the dust and debris. He was no longer a weakened king. He was a storm of pure fury. His golden eyes were not glowing, they were blazing. 2 miniature suns of incandescent rage. His royal guard were behind him, a wall of grim death. "Morven!" Lycan's voice was not a shout. It was a low, seismic rumble that promised utter annihilation. Morven laughed, delighted. "You're too late, old wolf. The ritual is nearly complete. Watch as I take what is yours." He lunged with the dagger. Time seemed to slow. Alara saw Lycan fighting, a blur of motion as he carved a path through the cultists, his desperation a tangible force. She saw Gunnar and the other guards engaging the enemy, a whirlwind of steel and fury. She saw Lycan take a wound, a shadow blade slicing across his arm as he fought to reach her. Seeing him hurt, seeing his blood spill for her, something inside Alara did not just break. It detonated. The despair, the fear, the pain of the ritual, her rage at Morven, and her fierce, protective love for Lycan. It all coalesced into a single, critical point of pure energy. The power sleeping in her blood, the magic of the first winter did not just stir. It erupted. It was not a scream. It was a wave of absolute silence and absolute cold. A tidal wave of pure, silver-white light and elemental frost exploded from her body. It was not the angry red of Morven's runes, but a clean, cold, and utterly unforgiving power. The silver chains holding her down did not just break, they sublimated, turning from solid to vapor in an instant. The stone altar beneath her cracked and frosted over. The wave of energy slammed into the chanting cultists, their voices cutting off abruptly. They were not thrown back. They were frozen solid, statues of black ice in the middle of their dark ritual. The glowing red runes on the floor sputtered and died, overwhelmed by a power far older and purer. Morven was thrown back, not by the force, but by the sheer psychic shock of the power she had unleashed. He stumbled, his eyes wide with disbelief and, for the first time, fear. Alara sat up. The air around her shimmered with frost. Her eyes, once the color of a winter sky, now glowed with the same silver-white light that poured from her. The mark on her wrist was a beacon, a miniature star of impossible brightness. She was no longer a shivering, terrified girl. She was a nexus of primordial power. She rose to her feet, her gaze locking onto Morven. The cold emanating from her was not just a temperature. It was an expression of absolute will. What are you?" Morven stammered, scrambling backward. Lycan had stopped fighting, his own battle forgotten. He stood with his guards, staring at her with an expression of profound, terrified awe. He had known she was powerful. He had not known she was this. "You called me a dove," Alara said, her voice no longer a whisper. It was clear and cold as a winter night, echoing with a power that was not entirely her own. "You called me a key. You called me worthless." She took a step toward him, and the very floor cracked with frost beneath her feet. "I am the Winter Queen," she declared, the words a statement of fact, a claiming of her own identity. And in that moment, she knew it to be true. This power was hers. It had always been hers. Morven snarled, his fear momentarily replaced by rage and greed. "That power will be mine." He lunged at her, his shadow dagger raised. Alara did not move. She simply raised her hand. The air between them dropped to absolute zero. Morven's lunge slowed, his movements becoming sluggish. Frost crawled up his robes, his arms, his face. His expression of fury was frozen into a mask of horror. He was encased, not in a block of ice, but in a perfect, crystalline prison that captured his final moment of terrified realization. A statue of his own failure. The silence in the chamber was absolute. The battle was over. The silver light radiating from Alara slowly subsided. The frost on the ground receded. She swayed, the expenditure of so much power leaving her drained and shaky. Before she could fall, strong arms were around her. She looked up into Lycan's blazing golden eyes. The rage was gone, replaced by an overwhelming mix of awe, relief, and a love so profound it made her heart ache. "Alara," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled her against his chest, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. She buried her face in his shoulder, her strength giving out. The connection between them, raw and wounded before, now flooded with warmth and light. It was no longer a thread, but a brilliant, unbreakable river of shared life, shared soul. She felt his love, his pride, his utter devotion pour into her, healing the last of the wounds Morven had inflicted. "I told you that you were stronger than you knew," he murmured into her hair. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "You were never worthless. You are the heart of my kingdom, the heart of me." She looked at him, at the truth in his incredible eyes, and she finally, truly believed it. The girl who scrubbed floors was gone, frozen and shattered like Morven's ambitions. In her place was someone new, someone powerful, someone loved. She reached up, her hand tracing the line of his jaw. Her mark on her wrist pulsed with a gentle, warm light. As her fingers touched his skin, the light flowed from her to him. A gasp escaped his lips and he looked down. There, over his heart, a matching mark was forming. Not of a wolf and roses, but of a radiant, six-pointed snowflake surrounded by a crown of thorns. The bond was no longer just his claim on her. It was complete. A two-way connection, a perfect, balanced whole. "Mine," she whispered, echoing the first word he had ever claimed her with. But her word was not a statement of possession. It was a promise. A slow smile, the first genuine smile she had ever seen on his harsh face, transformed him. It was like watching the sunrise after a long, dark night. Yours, he confirmed, his voice deep and certain. Always. He led her from the frozen chamber of death, his arm securely around her. His royal guard, their faces filled with a new and deeper respect, fell in step behind them. They walked through the silent fortress, past the frozen forms of their enemies and the bodies of the fallen. Outside, the unnatural blizzard had broken. The sun was rising, casting a brilliant, rosy glow on the fresh snow. The air was clean and cold. Gathered at the base of the mountain were the combined forces of Lycan's army and the allied packs who had answered his call. Thousands of warriors stood in the snow, their faces turned up toward the fortress. Lycan led her to the edge of the shattered gatehouse, where they could be seen by all. A hush fell over the assembled army. They saw their king, alive and victorious, and they saw the woman at his side. He did not need to shout. His voice, imbued with his alpha power, carried across the snow-covered valley. The Shadow King is dead! The Ember Covenant is broken! A roar of triumph erupted from the army, a wave of sound that shook the very mountains. Lycan waited for it to subside. Then he raised their joined hands, showing them her mark, now a calm, steady silver against her skin. "Behold!" he called out, his voice ringing with pride and power. "Your queen! Alara of the first winter, my mate, my heart!" Alara stood beside him, the gazes of thousands upon her. There was no scorn in their eyes. There was no pity. There was only awe, reverence, and acceptance. She was not the Dreg. She was not invisible. She was seen, truly seen. She felt the warmth of Lycan's hand, the solid strength of his presence beside her, the unbreakable bond humming between them like a symphony. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the rising sun, at the dawn of her new life. The cold was gone. For the first time in her memory, Alara felt truly, deeply warm. She was home.